Hello and welcome to the show where I try and make a little sense out of this stunning and brave new world that we all live in by talking to a series of expert witnesses about their experiences and concerns. It's important in life to be in touch with your feelings, but it's also crucial to be able to back those feelings up with facts. And so the purpose of this show is to push past purely personal or political promoting positions, separate fact from fiction and fake news headlines, all in the hope of uncovering important home truths. And today I'm talking sense not sensibility with writer and researcher William Callous, author of The Empathy Gap, Male Disadvantages and the Mechanisms of Their Neglect. In a conversation recorded earlier this year, we discuss current state-sponsored gendered approaches to addressing domestic violence, and how this slanted approach can demonise men and even endanger children. In particular, we focus on the example of Women's Aid's Child First campaign and the grossly misleading narrative promoted in their 2016 report, 19 Child Homicides, which inspired and informed an emergency government review of practices in family courts. The report highlighted 12 cases of parents killing their children whilst on contact visits over a 10-year period. In all 12 cases, the perpetrator was male. However, William's very careful and considered analysis of the relevant data revealed a significantly less gendered reality, and in his report 332 Child Homicides effectively exposes the fraudulent nature of the narrative presented to Parliament by one of the UK's leading domestic abuse charities. I'll include a link to his findings in the low bar, but to begin with, I asked William to say a little bit about what initially motivated him to research the reliability of certain gendered narratives and whether he had any reservations about sharing his conclusions with the wider world.
I'll answer that last one immediately. A lot of reservations. A lot of reservations. Because, I mean, like many people, I'm not, in my day-to-day life, I'm not very open about these issues because there's no point. I mean, I've made overtures to people tentatively, and you pretty soon realise there's no receptivity there. So you have to back off because, and the trouble is, in my case, I've been sort of drilling into the details for so long now. The gulf between me and, if you like, typical Joe Public or Josephine Public is so huge now that it just makes it even more difficult to communicate. So, but to start at the beginning then, my unease with things to do with gender go back right to the early 80s. Okay. It's that long ago. And just because, my wife is a lifelong Guardian reader, and we have the Guardian lying about the house, not that I read it very avidly. Yeah. I would flick through it and, well, you can understand thinking, yes, this is not exactly a balanced story that we're getting here. But of course, I was young. I had a young family, and I was, had a demanding job, so I didn't have time to do anything about it then. Yeah, it just niggled. For decades, actually, and it wasn't until, I suppose there were sort of. The worst signpost points, sort of landmark points. I remember Greenham Common was one of them. I don't know if that name means anything to you. Yeah. That was a staging post for me because I realised that Greenham Common was a feminist thing. Yes. Yeah. Which no one at the time was actually saying, but that came home to me very clearly that what we have here is feminist PR, because it was perfect for them. There was a barbed wire fence, and on the other side there were men, and they were all men, and they had weapons of mass destruction, right? And on the other side were these poor women living in benders. And what did these poor women living in benders do if any men turned up to the peace camp? They told them to go away. And this is what alerted me to it. And the story at the time was, we're worried it might provoke violence. And I thought, that doesn't ring true. No, what they were doing, whether consciously or unconsciously, is keeping the division between the bad guys with the weapons of mass destruction and the good people on the other side of the fence absolutely clear along gender lines. I thought, I understand this now.
That's interesting.
I was about 80, 86 or something, 84.
Yeah. Funny, I'm kind of an age where I would have been at school when Grade in Common was happening, and I've a vague memory of it, but kind of the main reason I would concur with the kind of the feminist connection you were making was my English teacher, who was, fairly radically feminist. She would go every summer holidays. She would, during her leave time, she would go to Grade in Common.
This is from Northern Ireland, was it?
Yeah, from Northern Ireland, and it was partly obviously to do with her politics, but there was definitely a very social element to it as well. She kind of it was kind of what she did on her holidays, and there was that that kind of comradeship. So I was certainly aware that it was a women only kind of camp. I remember that much. I think kind of talking from my own experience, one of the things that sort of connects with what you're saying is kind of quite often there's just a kind of feeling that this doesn't seem exactly right, or some of this doesn't ring true in terms of some of the facts that have been put forward. But whenever sort of there are just overwhelming facts and information pouring from one side of the conversation, it tends to be kind of, as you say, a kind of feeling that it takes quite a while to kind of find evidence, and that's one of the reasons why I think your work is so important, because you crunch the numbers very diligently and very fairly. Kind of it is. I think that's one of the things that when you start to look at sociological research, particularly. My background's also psychology, and it's been interesting to kind of slowly understand that a lot of the research that we were kind of taught parrot at the time, has been, if not disproven, but has a lot of kind of repeatability or reliability, questions. So, I mean, would you describe? Would you say there was kind of like one specific red pill moment, as they call it, or is it really just something that kind of developed over time as you started to look at the facts? And
well, there was probably the next sort of landmark was probably a personal thing when I was going through a pretty difficult time at work and domestically as well.
Okay.
That was in the early 90s, and that coincided with when Neil Linden's book came out in 92, which I bought.
Yes.
So that and I also bought David Thomas's book that came out the next year in 93. So and sometime later, Warren Farrell's book Myth and Male Power came out in 93, but I didn't get that until a few years later, but I did get that. Okay. So I was beginning to see there was another narrative that I'd suspected there was, but not seen the evidence. But actually, I think it was not so much one red pill moment as a slow sliding of the red pill down the throat over a number of years or decades.
Okay.
And I just didn't have time, being busy at work and what have you, to really get into it. But I only started to get into it when I was downshifting at work, preparatory to retiring, and subsequently did retire. So I'm retired now. Yeah. So it's only since I eased off at work that I've had the time to start looking into it. And I started looking into it in a big way in 2013.
Okay.
And I just got completely fed up at that point with what politicians were saying, because I knew by then it was a desperately slanted narrative.
Could you maybe give an example?
What's the black woman politician, Corbyn's lady love?
Diane Abbott.
Diane Abbott, yeah. She made a rather well-publicised speech in 2013, which was about essentially what we now call toxic masculinity, and it was all about men these days. They're all Jack Daniels swilling, Viagra crunching, non-committal, wasters, this, it was terrible.
Were he too drinking, possibly?
Yeah, well, so I thought to myself, which men do I know, whether in my family or colleagues or people I just know about the place, I fit this description? Oh, yeah. Well, the answer was none. So, and I saw her on one or two documentary programs talking about this speech, but no one challenged her on it. No one says, which men are you talking about? Are you talking about me? Are you talking about the man behind the camera?
Yeah.
It was itching to ask her these questions. Which men are you talking about? You're not talking about black men, are you, Diane?
Yes, indeed.
I mean, you could really push it, but no one did.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's when I suppose that was a sort of red pill moment, because I remember sitting down at my word processor and opening up Word and writing "That's it!" ! And then I just did a sort of brain dump on the page, which is what later turned into serious research. But and I started. I don't know why I started with this, but I started looking at things to do with Vogue, violence against women and girls, official documents on the Home Office and CPS, MOJ. And I remember that I was shocked. I was genuinely shocked because I hadn't seen it before. Yeah. Just what the narrative was at the official level, not the Guardian or the BBC, but emanating from government. It was so one-sided. And in those documents, men and boys only appeared as men and boys can also help by stopping the violence against women and girls.
Exactly, yeah.
I read it over and over again. I thought, is this real? Have I missed something? I remember actually doing searches for violence against men and boys. It seems so naive now, but so I suppose that was a red pill moment when I realised how deep the rabbit hole went, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because that's very kind of, in a way, it's very similar to my own experience, because it was the issue of domestic violence and the statutory services around that and all the implications. Once you actually started to realise, that very quickly then for me became, well, this is quite shocking, because kind of my, I suppose, my belief and my drive is about promotion of championing equality. And that to me, the current state of the violence against women and girls strategy, it's the most obvious state structured, state enforced, segregated, direct sex discrimination in Britain today, without doubts. So and so some of the work you've done in terms of kind of looking at the narrative, the talk you did last year, where you mentioned the Extraordinary Women's Aid campaign. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? I've forgotten what it's called now. The
19 child homicides report and the Child First campaign. Yeah.
Child First. Yeah.
Yeah, that was when was that? In 2016, perhaps. It's not the first time they've done this. They did it about 8-10 years ago, and it's essentially a repetition of the same approach. That let's just backtrack a bit. The feminist objective, the main feminist objective, is to make women independent of men. It's not equality; it's to make women independent of men.
Okay.
There's two strands to that. There's financial independence and there's domestic independence. So they want to be financially independent so they can be independent of men, and they also want the freedom to get men out of the house.
Okay.
So it will be the woman's choice whether she tolerates a man there or gets rid of the man. So they want to give women that power, and the way in which well, it's not just the family courts. It's not accurate to say it's just the family courts, but the way in which society operates does give mothers the advantage when it comes to custody.
Yeah.
Just naturally, because most people are sympathetic to the child is best with the mother.
Yeah.
But the feminist message reinforces that, and where there is pushback from the man, they have a means of dealing with that by claiming men are dangerous. So the issue of claiming men are dangerous, and this is the Vorg narrative as well as the specific sort of practice direction 12J issue, which is the court directive with respect to domestic violence in custody.
Okay.
Issues. It's all about being able to represent men as dangerous to facilitate women's being able to get men out of the house. So in other words, women being independent men, that's what it actually comes down to. And so they play this one string fiddle,
yeah,
over and over, whether it's via the Vorg policies or by specifically saying, look, here are a dozen cases where men have been granted custody, or not granted custody, but granted contact with the child, and the men have gone on to kill the child.
Yeah.
And sometimes the mother as well, sometimes they've committed suicide as well.
Yeah.
And there was the 19 child homicide report was a report reporting on such cases. Now what they'd done is they'd trawled 10 years of data, 10 years of serious case reviews, which would be thousands and thousands of serious case reviews, to cherry pick. I don't think the word cherry is quite appropriate, but
okay. Yeah.
Select whatever an anti-cherry is. These appalling cases. The cases are real, of course. They've not made them up. But in terms of statistics, it's massively unrepresentative. But they're appealing to emotion, and they've appealed to emotion very successfully. But they're also very well organised, because they planned this campaign. They got this report together. They got their acolytes, whatever you want to call them, to canvass their MPs. They won a debate in Parliament, and they had this debate in Parliament to further promulgate the contents of this 19 child homicide report. It wasn't a real debate, of course, because all the MPs were repeating the words of Women's Aid.
Yeah.
Because what else could they do? Well, a brave man or a brave woman could have stood up and objected, but you're really swimming against the tide. So they're effectively manipulating Parliament to come on board with the narrative. And it's all done by appealing to violence against women. Men are dangerous. But statistically, it's invalid, of course. And I asked myself the question, what would happen if you just looked through all the case reviews and tried to trawl everything out?
Yeah.
Every case where there's been a child death, what do you actually find? And so I did that. I intended to trawl 10 years of cases, but reading these serious case reviews, it really takes a toll on your psyche. I managed to get through 7 years worth.
Wow.
And by then I'd got 332 cases of what I can't really strictly call homicide. I call them culpable child killings, because they wouldn't all have been registered as homicides. This is another story there, but you could tell from these case reviews that there was culpable child deaths, like a child being left unsupervised in the bath, or co-sleeping with a parent or parents who were very heavily drunk or on drugs, and the child was suffocated. There's quite a lot of cases like that, but also very overt homicide cases where it's just violence. And I tried to assign who was culpable, and it turned out that there were more mothers culpable, from what I could see, than men, whether the men were fathers or not.
Yeah.
And actually, that's not all that surprising, because if you look at there isn't comparable data, official data, in the UK that I'm aware of. The ONS doesn't publish or it doesn't fully publish the sex of perpetrators of child killers. It publishes some data, but it's incomplete. But there is much more complete data from the States, and a much bigger database there, of course. And there you find also that culpable child deaths are more attributable to mothers and fathers by quite a lot, actually. It's not even close.
Okay. Yeah. And that, I mean, obviously each one of those cases and each one of those stories is going to have its own context and detail and tragedy attached to it, and sort of all sorts of things, and kind of these. I suppose the purpose of conducting exercises like that is not to condemn one sex over the other kind
Absolutely.
of thing. But
absolutely. Can I just amplify that, because that's a very important point. And I said this in my speech, that's absolutely not the purpose. I am absolutely not trying to do the same thing that Women's Aid do by pointing at women, saying, no, look, women are all dangerous to children. How preposterous would that be? I'm not repeating that same mendacious folly. Absolutely not. All I was trying to do was to point out the fallaciousness of that line of argument.
Yes.
Because actually, horrible though these cases are, they're a drop in the ocean, actually. Yeah. They're not representative of the vast number of cases that go through the family courts. I got 332 in 7 years.
Yeah. Okay.
What's that, 40 or 50 a year? Well, there's about 45 to 50,000 child arrangement cases go through the England and Wales family courts each year. And that's only about a third of the total, because 2/3 don't go through the courts.
Yeah.
So these cases are numerically a very, very tiny proportion of the total. And also, if you read the cases, you can see we're talking here about, in general, there might be exceptions, but in general, you're talking about the absolute rock bottom of society, where alcoholism, drug addiction, mental ill health are all major components of what's going on. So the three, whether it's 19 or 332, it's completely fallacious to try to draw any conclusions from that regarding how you should handle the normal everyday cases in family courts about contact. Is a completely false argument.
Yeah, as I say, certainly for me, the domestic violence issue was probably a gateway into just looking at, the perspective of gender equality from both sides more deeply, more accurately, and seeking information that isn't necessarily, kind of readily promoted. But that issue particularly, I just find so shocking because of the implications for women and children as much as for men, in terms of the way the perspective, the narrative is pushed, that basically, kind of there are so few services for men. Men are pushed out of these services, and as you say, kind of portrayed, particularly in an intellectually honest way as a group, for particular purposes. And that was the thing that your research showed very clearly. Kind of, it's not a case of kind of first past the post, whoever, whichever sex is the most culpable parents or whatever, kind of should be excluded from services, or it is quite shocking. And particularly, for me, the thing that is most shocking is the potential impact on children. Theresa May obviously made an announcement a couple of days ago about producing, I believe it is a statutory duty for councils to provide refuge to victims of domestic violence. Are you familiar with that?
Not familiar with that one. I'm not caught up with that one. Of course, there is the draft domestic violence bill going through at the moment. I'm not sure whether the consultation's finished yet. And there are promises about spend on DV, including $500,000 for men in the document. So maybe it's associated with that. But no, I'm not up to speed on that one.
Okay, no, because it's been interesting to watch or observe, kind of particular high-profile feminists. They've been very much kind of celebrating this news, but very much, as always, using the exclusive language of women and children. This is great news for women and children. We must ensure that this means that there's, diversity of services to take into account the, intersectional diversity of women and children, and, kind of just completely excluding men from the conversation, even though the message did seem to be very clearly that there were 2 million estimated victims annually, based on the kind of police sort of crime research, which would include that. From my understanding, that includes men. That includes the kind of 40%.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, that would be about 800,000 men or 700,000 men and 3 million women. Something of that ballpark.
I think that's one of the most actually disgusting things I've noticed is the number of times that those sort of statistics are used and promoted as women and children, or and so they're actually using the statistics of male victims, but they're pretending that it's something that just ignoring the male victims.
Well, that's what the CPS Vorg reports do, of course.
Yeah,
and that's what they do for all the Vorg data. It includes male victims.
Yeah. But and very often it's presented as if it's not.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And it's difficult to tell whether the people that do that are simply in ignorance of that, because if you get the data from the CPS Vorg reports, you have to be an astute observer or well informed to know that the data. I mean, it does say now on the front cover, inclusive of data for men and boys, but even so, by the time you've opened it up, there's very little clue inside that that's the case.
Yeah.
So you have to be in the know, really.
Yeah.
So it might be ignorance on behalf of some people.
Yeah. No, absolutely. One kind of generous way that I would, kind of talk about feminism as a kind of movement in the 21st century, kind of bearing in mind that obviously, we've had arguably 4 waves of feminism, and feminism seems to mean so many different things to so many people. But one description I thought was certainly worth kind of considering is that it is essentially a trade union movement exclusively for the rights of women, which, kind of in some respects, I would certainly accept and acknowledge that women, have challenges and face discrimination in their lifetime, but clearly also men do. And one of the most shocking things that I find about the behavior of feminists is it often so closely mirrors their description of, kind of whether you call them non-feminists or whether you call them men's rights activists or whether you call them male supremacists,
Not the latter, please.
Yeah. And, kind of clearly one purpose there is to shut down conversation and debate, because as a movement, they do have an extraordinary amount of ground in terms of the public arena of what's acceptable discussion about gender equality. What do you think about that?
Oh yeah, they have, and it's getting worse. I mean, they look what Mike and Elizabeth are, what the struggles they have getting on universities, and it's not just them, of course. It's a great long list of people.
Yeah,
that are no platform now. But that's not from the traditional second wave radical feminists. Of course, that's from the very different SJW progressive axis, which I find even more frightening, to be honest with you.
Frightening times indeed. That's all for today, I'm afraid, but happily you can hear more from my chat with William by following the links below. As promised, I'll also include a link to the 19 Callous Homicide report, along with William's extremely detailed response, and of course details of the best way to get a copy of his quite extraordinary book. Our conversation was recorded in May 2019, and you may have noticed that I briefly mentioned a statement by the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, where she outlined a commitment to end the postcode lottery experienced by victims of abuse by placing a legal duty to support and house those fleeing domestic abuse. And as this podcast is going out on the 19th of November 2019 to mark International Men's Day, I'll finish with a clip highlighting a report published on Sunday by Fathers for Justice, which helps to shine a light on just how bad that postcode lottery currently is when it comes to the matter of male victims of abuse.
Yeah, so this is a report by the charity Fathers for Justice. They contacted 400 councils and 5 of them have reported saying that they have accommodation that's available for vulnerable men. Now, these are men who may be in relationships where they are at risk of losing their lives because of violence meted out by their partners. If that were the situation for women, there would be national outcry. And the thing about domestic violence against men, whether they're in same-sex relationships or heterosexual relationships, is that it's domestic violence. It's as damaging. It destroys lives. It puts children at risk and it puts vulnerable adults at risk. And I just think it's extraordinary.
It's just very...
men are overlooked.
Well, it isn't seen in the same way, is it? Men are not seen as vulnerable in that same way.
They're not seen as victims. And there's the kind of the notion that, well, how could you be terrorised by a woman? You're bigger, or by your partner, because you're a big, strong man. And that is part of the reason that we have a national epidemic of male suicide as well. Because men aren't able to say, I need help. This bad thing is happening to me and I don't know what to do. And it's a responsibility that we all have to make this, a priority to address.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.